Episode 3. The Skinwalker. Warning: if you have ever heard your name called from outside your house at night, and it didn't sound quite right, stop watching now, because some legends don't chase you, they become you. In the vast desert landscapes of the American Southwest, beneath endless skies and silent mesas, there exists a legend older than colonization, older than borders, older than the highways that now slice through the land. It is not a ghost story. It is not a simple monster tale. Among the Navajo people, the Skinwalker is spoken of in whispers, referred to indirectly, rarely discussed openly, because even saying too much is believed to attract attention. It is known traditionally as a Yi-Naldlushi, roughly translated as with it. He goes on all fours. But what that truly means is far darker. The Skinwalker is said to be a witch, a human being who chose power over humanity, who committed unforgivable acts to gain the ability to shapeshift into animals, to wear their skins, to mimic their voices, and to move between forms as easily as shadow moves between light. And unlike other legends, this one does not belong to abandoned castles or distant mountains. It belongs to real communities, real land, real fear. The most chilling detail about the Skinwalker is this: it begins as a person, not a spirit, not a demon born in darkness, a human, someone who deliberately walks a forbidden path. According to traditional belief, to become a Skinwalker, one must perform an act so morally corrupt that it severs them from their humanity, often involving betrayal of family. Once that line is crossed, the transformation begins. The individual gains unnatural abilities, superhuman speed, enhanced strength, the power to transform into coyotes, wolves, owls, or even mimic the appearance of other humans. But the transformation is never perfect. Something is always slightly wrong. The eyes shine strangely in headlights. The limbs bend just a little too far. The voice repeats phrases slightly delayed, slightly distorted, as if learning how to speak by copying rather than understanding. For decades, stories of strange encounters have circulated beyond reservation boundaries, carried by truck drivers, hikers, and rural families living near desert highways. One of the most commonly reported experiences involves seeing an animal behaving in a way that feels disturbingly human. A coyote standing upright for a moment too long, a deer staring directly into a car window without fear, a wolf pacing alongside a vehicle at impossible speed, matching 60 miles per hour effortlessly before vanishing into darkness. In many accounts, witnesses describe locking eyes with the creature and feeling intelligence behind the gaze. Not instinct, not animal curiosity, calculation. In the 1990s, reports from a particular ranch in northeastern Utah brought national attention to Skinwalker lore. The property became infamous for unexplained livestock mutilations, massive wolf-like creatures resistant to gunfire, poltergeist activity inside the home, and strange lights hovering over fields. Though investigators attempted to document evidence scientifically, much of what occurred defied simple explanation. Cattle were found with surgical-like incisions and no blood at the scene. Security cameras malfunctioned precisely when phenomena occurred. Family members reported seeing creatures that looked like wolves, but were far larger, creatures that allowed humans to approach within feet before, revealing unnatural strength. While skeptics suggested predators or hoaxes, the ranch's events intensified modern fascination with the Skinwalker legend. But to the Navajo, this was not entertainment. It was confirmation of something long understood. These entities exist at the intersection of witchcraft and transformation. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Skinwalker is its ability to mimic human voices. Survivors frequently describe hearing family members calling from outside late at night. A mother hears her child crying from the yard, only to find the child asleep inside. A man hears his brother asking for help near the tree line, but when he steps outside, the voice shifts location, now behind him, then above him, then nowhere. The mimicry is imperfect, but convincing enough to lure victims into darkness. Some accounts describe the voice repeating the same phrase over and over, slightly changing tone each time, as if testing which version sounds most authentic. And when the victim realizes something is wrong, it is often already too late. Modern encounters continue. In 2016, a couple driving along a remote highway near tribal land reported seeing what they first believed was a large dog injured on the roadside. As they slowed down, the animal stood up on two legs. It remained there for several seconds, staring directly at them, before dropping back to all fours and sprinting into the desert at unnatural speed. The couple later described overwhelming dread and nausea, physical symptoms that persisted for hours. Their vehicle reportedly experienced electrical malfunctions for days afterward. Though such stories circulate online, they share consistent details: wrong proportions, wrong movement, wrong sound. The sense that whatever was seen was imitating life, not living it. Anthropologists studying the legend emphasize that the Skinwalker belief is deeply tied to cultural teachings about balance and morality. It represents the ultimate abuse of spiritual power, the inversion of healing practices into harmful magic. In Navajo culture, medicine men and women serve communities through protection and restoration. The Skinwalker is the opposite, a healer turned predator, a guardian turned hunter. This moral inversion adds weight to the fear, because it suggests knowledge can be corrupted, that sacred traditions, when twisted, become weapons. But outside cultural context, modern paranormal investigators often blur lines between folklore and extraterrestrial theories, cryptid research, and conspiracy speculation. Some claim Skinwalker sightings overlap with UFO activity. Others suggest interdimensional beings, yet these interpretations often ignore the cultural origins of the legend. For the communities who carry the story, it is neither alien nor animal. It is human corruption manifesting physically, and that idea may be more frightening than any monster, because it implies the potential exists within humanity itself. One former park ranger anonymously described an encounter while patrolling remote desert land at dusk. He noticed a large coyote watching him from a ridge. The animal did not flee as he approached. Instead, it stepped behind a rock formation, and moments later, a tall, thin human figure emerged from the same spot. The ranger insisted there was no time for a person to hide and swap places. The figure stared briefly before retreating behind the rocks again. When he climbed the ridge to investigate, there were only paw prints in the sand, no human footprints. He never reported the incident officially. The desert at night carries sound differently. Wind moves through canyon walls, like whispers. Coyotes howl in patterns that echo. It is easy, skeptics argue, for the mind to misinterpret shapes and sounds in low light. And yet, witnesses consistently describe something beyond misinterpretation, the unmistakable sense of being studied, followed, measured. The Skinwalker does not attack randomly. It chooses moments of isolation. It exploits familiarity. It waits for doors to open. Perhaps the most unsettling question is this: if the Skinwalker can wear the shape of an animal, or even mimic a person, how would you ever know? What subtle detail would reveal the truth? The wrong blink pattern, the shadow moving half a second too late, the smile that stretches slightly wider than natural. In several modern urban accounts, individuals have claimed to encounter acquaintances who behaved subtly wrong, repeating phrases, staring too long, standing unnaturally still. Though such stories blur into urban legend territory, the psychological impact remains potent. The idea that something could replace someone without immediate detection strikes at primal trust. And this is where episode 3 begins to descend deeper. Because in part 2, we examine cases where families believed something had infiltrated their homes, where pets reacted violently to empty corners, where surveillance cameras captured figures that did not match anyone present, and where the question stopped being, "What did we see?" and became, "Who is still human?" If the Wendigo was hunger made flesh, the Skinwalker's identity stolen, and the most dangerous predator is the one that already knows your face. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Warning: if your dog has ever barked at something you couldn't see, if your security camera ever glitched at the exact wrong moment, if someone you love has ever knocked on your door but felt slightly off, Listen carefully, because sometimes the Skinwalker doesn't stay in the desert. Sometimes it follows you home. In remote communities near tribal lands, families often tell stories not about something seen in the distance, but about something that approached the house directly. Not scratching like an animal, not breaking in like a burglar, just testing. One Navajo woman described hearing footsteps circling her home at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night for nearly a week. The steps were slow, measured, crunching gravel deliberately. Her dogs would growl, but never bark low, terrified sounds unlike anything she had heard before. On the fifth night, the footsteps stopped outside her bedroom window, and then she heard her grandmother's voice whisper her name. The problem was, her grandmother had died years earlier. The voice did not beg. It did not scream. It simply repeated her name softly, patiently, as if waiting for her to answer. She did not move. She did not respond. By morning, there were large animal tracks in the dirt beneath her window, coyote prints, but they ended abruptly, as though whatever made them had stepped into air. Across state lines in Arizona, a rural family installed security cameras after their livestock began behaving erratically. Chickens refused to roost. Horses backed into corners of their pens at night. One camera recorded what appeared to be a large canine walking upright for several steps before dropping back onto all fours. The footage glitched heavily, distorting the frame around the creature's head. Skeptics later claimed it was digital artifacting, combined with poor lighting. But the family insisted the glitching only occurred when that shape entered frame. In the following weeks, the father reported seeing a tall figure standing near the property fence line during dusk. He described the eyes as reflective, but set too far apart. When he raised a rifle, the figure tilted its head slowly, not startled, not afraid, and then moved sideways behind a shed. By the time he reached the spot, nothing remained. No footprints, no disturbance, just silence. The Skinwalker's ability to mimic is what makes these encounters escalate from frightening to psychologically destabilizing. One of the most frequently repeated patterns in modern accounts is the double presence phenomenon, when someone inside a home hears a family member calling from outside, while that same family member is physically inside the house. A teenage boy in New Mexico once reported hearing his mother's voice from the backyard asking for help with groceries. He opened the back door slightly, only to feel an overwhelming wave of dread wash over him. Something felt wrong. The voice repeated the request, but the tone was flat, emotionless, like a recording. He shut the door and ran to the living room, where his mother was sitting on the couch. She had not gone outside. Moments later, heavy knocking rattled the back door. Not frantic, just 3 slow, spaced knocks. When they checked through the window, no one stood there. Animals react first. That detail appears again and again. Dogs that refuse to leave the porch after dark. Cats hissing at empty hallways. Livestock clustering tightly, as if hiding from a storm that never comes. Wildlife biologists often attribute this to predators scent in the area. Coyotes, wolves, mountain lions. But witnesses insist the fear feels different, prolonged, intentional, as though the predator is not hunting livestock, but observing the humans instead. There is also the matter of speed. Several drivers traveling through desert highways at night have described animals keeping pace with their vehicles at unnatural velocity. One man claimed a large wolf ran alongside his truck at 55 miles per hour for nearly a mile, glancing sideways into his window as if studying him. When he accelerated suddenly, the animal leaped ahead effortlessly and disappeared into scrub brush. The next morning, he discovered long scratch marks across his passenger door, too high to be caused by brush. He never drove that road again after sunset. But perhaps the most disturbing accounts involve something entering the home without force. Not breaking windows, not picking locks, just appearing. A young couple living near the Four Corners region reported waking at 3:33 a.m. to find their bedroom door slightly open, though they always locked it before sleeping. At the foot of their bed stood what they believed at first was their dog. It was the same size, same shape, but its back legs were slightly too long. its head angled at an unnatural tilt, and its eyes reflected a faint glow despite no light source in the room. The woman whispered the dog's name. The creature did not respond. It simply stared. Then, slowly, it smiled, stretching its mouth wider than any animal should. The man lunged for the lamp beside him. When the light snapped on, the doorway was empty. Their real dog was trembling in the hallway. Sleep paralysis, psychologists argue, can produce vivid hallucinations. Stress amplifies perception. Darkness plays tricks on the mind. And yet, in many cases, multiple witnesses report the same sighting simultaneously. Shared hallucinations are rare. Collective fear, however, spreads quickly, which leads to another layer of the Skinwalker legend: psychological warfare. It does not simply attack physically. It destabilizes households. It erodes trust. It creates paranoia. If you cannot trust what you hear, if you cannot trust what you see, how long before you begin to doubt the people around you? In some tribal traditions, protection rituals are used when Skinwalker activity is suspected. Blessings of the home. Sacred herbs burned to cleanse space. Songs meant to restore balance. These practices emphasize that the threat is spiritual, not merely physical. The Skinwalker feeds on fear and imbalance. It thrives where harmony breaks. And whether one believes in the literal entity or not, the psychological impact of fear can fracture families. There are rumors, unverified, whispered quietly, that some individuals accused of being skinwalkers were once respected members of their communities. That the transformation was not visible at first. Only subtle changes, reclusiveness, coldness, strange nighttime activity. But accusations carry danger. Historically, such fears have led to violence, exile, even killings, which is why discussing the legend openly remains taboo in many places, because belief itself can become weaponized. And yet, the encounters continue. Modern technology has not erased the fear. If anything, it has complicated it. Trail cameras capture fleeting shapes between frames. Audio recorders pick up distant calls that sound almost human but not quite synchronized with breath. Motion sensors trigger without visible cause. And in every case, witnesses describe the same feeling, being evaluated. The Skinwalker does not rush. It studies routines. It learns voices. It waits for the moment when you are most alone. And when it finally reveals itself, it does not roar or lunge. It stands, watching, letting you see just enough to know something is terribly wrong. In part 3, we move beyond homes and highways. We investigate reports from law enforcement officers, ranchers, and field researchers who claim to have tracked something across miles of desert. Something that left paw prints that transformed into human footprints something that seemed aware of being followed. Something that did not flee, but circled back. Because the most terrifying possibility is not that the Skinwalker hunts randomly. It chooses. And once it chooses you, it may already be closer than you think. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Warning: if you ever follow footprints in the desert and they suddenly change shape, stop. Do not take another step, because whatever you're tracking may already be tracking you back. Law enforcement officers rarely speak publicly about paranormal encounters, but in remote regions, near tribal lands, there are quiet stories, shared off-record stories, of patrol units responding to calls about prowlers, only to find tracks in the dirt that begin as animal prints and end as human footprints. One deputy described arriving at a rural property after a family reported something circling their livestock enclosure. The ground was soft from recent rain, making impressions clear. At first, he saw what looked like large canine tracks pacing along the fence line. The stride was long, but consistent. Then, about 20 feet from the barn door, the prints shifted. The front paws seemed to elongate. The spacing narrowed, and within 3 steps, the tracks were unmistakably human, bare human feet, pressing deep into the mud. There were no signs of someone removing shoes, no transition marks, just animal, becoming human. The prints led to the side of the house, and then they stopped, not turned back, not continued. stopped, as if whatever made them simply vanished. Search and rescue volunteers have described similar anomalies during missing person operations. In 2018, a hiker disappeared after texting friends that he felt watched near a canyon trail at dusk. When teams searched the area, they discovered unusual tracks alongside the hiker's boot prints, coyote prints, that ran parallel to his path for nearly half a mile. At certain intervals, the coyote prints overlapped perfectly with his own steps, as if walking in sync. Then, in one section of soft sand, the hiker's boot prints ended abruptly. In their place were human footprints that did not match his shoe size, slightly larger, deeper, toes splayed unnaturally. Those footprints circled once, and then turned back toward the canyon. The missing man was never found. Officially, authorities cited terrain hazards. Privately, some volunteers refused to join future searches in that area after sunset. Ranchers tell of creatures that test boundaries without crossing them, standing just beyond property lines, watching from ridges, appearing at the edge of headlights. One elderly rancher claimed he fired 3 rounds at a massive wolf-like animal that refused to retreat from his cattle. He swore he saw the bullets strike its body, saw fur ripple, yet the creature did not flinch. Instead, it stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to communicate something unsettling, confidence. Then, it turned sideways and walked into darkness, its shape seeming to stretch unnaturally as it moved. The next morning, the rancher found large paw prints in the dust, but halfway down the trail, the prints narrowed and lengthened into barefoot human tracks leading toward a dry wash. Field researchers investigating unexplained livestock mutilations have documented patterns that fuel speculation. Animals found drained of blood, with precise incisions. Organs removed with surgical accuracy. No predator tracks nearby. No drag marks. Some attribute these cases to natural decomposition combined with scavenger activity. Others insist the absence of blood at the scene is statistically abnormal. But what unsettles investigators most are reports of figures seen near the sites before or after discovery. Tall silhouettes watching from distances too far for facial identification, yet close enough to be clearly humanoid. When approached, these figures move with alarming speed, often disappearing behind terrain features that offer no immediate cover. Then there are the officers who describe auditory phenomena, radios crackling with voices that do not belong to dispatch. Whispers bleeding through static during patrols in isolated zones. One former trooper claimed his radio once repeated his own voice back to him seconds after he spoke, but distorted, stretched slightly slower, as if played through damaged tape. When he requested confirmation from dispatch, they reported no malfunction. That same night, he saw what appeared to be a man crouched along the roadside, wearing what looked like animal hide. As he slowed the vehicle, the figure stood abruptly, too tall, limbs too long, and darted into scrub brush with impossible acceleration. Backup arrived within minutes. No footprints were located in the rocky soil. The desert plays tricks with distance and scale. Heat shimmer can distort silhouettes. Low light can elongate shadows. Skeptics argue these environmental factors explain many sightings. Yet experienced trackers, individuals trained to read land-like language, insist certain anomalies defy environmental distortion. They describe gait patterns that shift mid-trail, strides that begin quadrupedal and end bipedal, claw impressions that narrow into toes, and perhaps most disturbing of all, trails that double back in perfect circles around investigators without leaving obvious transitional marks. Some tribal elders explain that the Skinwalker enjoys psychological dominance more than physical attack. It allows itself to be glimpsed. It leaves just enough evidence to seed fear. It circles search parties not to strike, but to remind them of vulnerability. In this interpretation, the transformation of tracks is symbolic as well as literal, a message that the boundary between animal and human has already been crossed. In one particularly unsettling account, a wildlife photographer camping alone near a dry canyon reported hearing movement around his tent shortly after midnight. He assumed coyotes were investigating food scent. The footsteps were light but deliberate. Then he heard breathing, slow, controlled, directly outside the tent wall near his head. He whispered into his voice recorder to document the sound. The breathing paused, and then, softly, something whispered back, repeating his words exactly as he had spoken them, but slightly delayed and with unnatural emphasis on certain syllables. He did not unzip the tent. He did not respond. By morning, there were tracks surrounding his campsite, canine prints circling in tight loops. At the edge of camp, one set of prints shifted into barefoot human impressions leading toward a ridge. The photographer left immediately and never returned to solo camping. Psychologists might label such experiences as stress responses triggered by isolation. The mind seeks patterns in ambiguous stimuli, but repeated patterns across independent witnesses complicate that explanation. The mimicry, the shifting tracks, the overwhelming dread preceding sightings, the sense of intelligence observing from concealment. These elements remain consistent across geography and time. There is also the matter of smell. Several witnesses mention a sudden stench preceding encounters, not decay exactly, but something metallic and earthy, like blood mixed with wet fur. The scent dissipates as quickly as it arrives. Some speculate it may be linked to adrenal response, the body interpreting danger before conscious recognition. Others believe it signals proximity, a warning that the transformation is near. And then there are the stories of pursuit. Not chase in the traditional sense, but inversion. Individuals who felt followed only to realize they were being herded, guided subtly toward isolation. A hiker hearing distant movement always slightly off trail. A driver noticing an animal silhouette appearing at each bend in the road ahead. A ranch hand discovering tracks, circling his own footprints, as if something had stepped precisely where he had stepped moments earlier. The implication is chilling. The skinwalker does not simply move through terrain. It anticipates movement. It calculates. In part 4, we confront the most disturbing possibility yet: infiltration. Accounts of individuals who claimed someone they knew began acting subtly wrong after suspected encounters. Subtle speech delays, eyes reflecting strangely in photographs, pets reacting violently to their presence. Because if the skinwalker can wear animal skin, what happens when it wears something far more convincing? The desert keeps its secrets buried beneath dust and bone. But sometimes, when wind shifts and tracks align under moonlight, the land tells a story in silence. And that story whispers one terrifying truth. Not everything that walks on two legs was born that way. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. Warning: if someone close to you has ever walked into a room and for a split second you felt something was wrong, not visibly wrong, not obviously different, just off, trust that feeling. Because some predators don't chase from the shadows. Some stand under your roof. There is a pattern buried deep within modern skinwalker accounts that investigators rarely discuss publicly, because it crosses from external threat into something far more destabilizing: replacement behavior. Not full physical transformation into another person in some cinematic way, but subtle infiltration, small shifts, micro delays in speech, expressions that linger a fraction too long, movements that seem rehearsed rather than natural. Families who report encounters in desert regions sometimes describe behavioral changes afterward, changes that begin gradually and intensify over weeks. A husband returning from checking livestock at night begins waking at odd hours and standing silently at windows. A teenager who once laughed easily now stares at family members without blinking. A grandmother claims her son's shadow moves a split second before he does when headlights pass through the room. One rural family in northern Arizona reported that after a series of unexplained animal sightings near their property, their youngest child began speaking about the tall dog. At first the parents assumed imagination. The child insisted the tall dog watched from the tree line but sometimes came closer. Then the child began saying the tall dog had learned how to stand like dad. The comment was brushed aside until one night when the father came home late from work. The family dog, normally affectionate, snarled and refused to approach him. The father laughed it off, blaming scent from the job site. But over the next week, The dog reacted the same way every evening, growling low, avoiding eye contact. One night, security footage captured the father entering the house through the back door, but seconds before that, the same camera briefly glitched, showing a tall, thin silhouette near the fence line. The timestamps overlapped by less than a minute. Skeptics called it camera error. The family moved within months. The concept of the skinwalker wearing a human form is controversial, even within folklore discussions. Traditional beliefs emphasize transformation into animals, yet many contemporary witnesses insist something more complex is occurring. They describe a sensation of being observed not just physically, but personally, as if routines are being studied, relationships mapped, vulnerabilities catalogued. In several reports, individuals who experienced prolonged sightings began having vivid dreams of animals standing upright at the foot of their beds. The dream figures would tilt their heads and speak in familiar voices. The dreamers often woke to find doors slightly ajar or windows unlocked. No forced entry, just subtle displacement. Law enforcement officials investigating stalking complaints in rural areas sometimes encounter cases where no human suspect can be identified. Footprints appear around properties, but trail patterns make little sense, circling tightly, doubling back in impossible geometry, sometimes overlapping perfectly with the homeowner's own prints from earlier that day. In one documented incident, a woman reported seeing her husband standing in their backyard at dusk, staring toward the woods. When she called his name from inside the house, he did not respond. Frustrated, she walked outside only to find the yard empty. Seconds later, her husband emerged from the shower upstairs, confused by her panic. She insisted she had seen him. Same clothes, same posture, same height. But something about the stance felt unnatural. Two rigid arms hanging too straight. There are also reports of voice mimicry escalating beyond outdoor luring. Some families describe hearing internal mimicry, voices whispering inside hallways when no one is present. A mother in New Mexico recounted hearing her daughter humming in the kitchen late at night. She walked down the hallway to investigate, only to find the kitchen dark and empty. The humming continued now from behind her, near the staircase. When she checked her daughter's room, the girl was asleep. The next morning, scratch marks appeared on the inside of the back door. 4 long vertical grooves at shoulder height. Psychologists might interpret these events through the lens of stress-induced paranoia, especially in communities steeped in folklore. Belief systems shape perception, but consistent physical anomalies complicate purely psychological explanations. Electronic malfunctions coinciding with sightings, animals reacting simultaneously to unseen stimuli, multiple witnesses describing identical figures without prior discussion, and perhaps, most unsettling of all, the phenomenon of emotional detachment. Several individuals who claimed close encounters reported feeling an abrupt coldness toward loved ones, afterward intrusive thoughts, suggesting distrust, suspicion, unfamiliarity, as though the presence they encountered did not simply observe them, but influenced them. Tribal elders warn that speaking too openly about skinwalkers invites attention. The belief is that naming them repeatedly strengthens their focus on the speaker. This cultural caution adds another layer of tension, because fear thrives in silence, and silence allows rumors to mutate. There have been tragic historical cases where accusations of being a skinwalker led to violence within communities. The line between legend and suspicion can blur dangerously. That is why responsible discussion requires acknowledging cultural context and avoiding sensationalism. Yet the persistence of encounter reports cannot be ignored. One former oil field worker described an incident that continues to disturb him years later. While working night shift near an isolated drilling site, he and a coworker saw a figure standing beside their parked truck. They assumed it was a third crew member. As they approached, the figure turned slowly. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its posture was unmistakably human. Then it dropped onto all fours, in a single fluid motion, and sprinted across open ground, faster than any animal he had seen. The coworker later quit without explanation. Months afterward, The worker began experiencing episodes where he would wake standing in his own living room with no memory of leaving bed. His wife once found him staring at the backyard fence at 3 a.m., whispering something unintelligible. He does not remember doing it. He insists he never felt physically harmed, but he admits something felt. Attached. Attachment. That word surfaces repeatedly in whispered accounts. Not possession in the dramatic sense, but proximity that lingers. Individuals who feel watched long after leaving the desert, dreams recurring in urban apartments hundreds of miles away, pets reacting to corners of rooms as though something followed them home. The idea that the skinwalker does not need to remain on tribal land, that once it marks someone, distance becomes irrelevant. And here lies the most destabilizing theory of all. What if transformation is not limited to one individual? What if the corruption spreads? Some speculative interpretations suggest that prolonged exposure to a skinwalker can influence human behavior, amplifying aggression, isolation, moral decay, not turning victims into monsters overnight, but eroding boundaries slowly. This idea aligns disturbingly with the legend's moral foundation, that the skinwalker begins as human corruption. If corruption can be chosen, can it also be transmitted? In one final account, before we descend into the conclusion, a young woman shared footage from her apartment security camera after returning from a camping trip near tribal land. The camera captured her entering the apartment at 9:14 p.m. Minutes later, at 9:17 p.m., the same camera recorded her walking down the hallway again, though she was already inside her bedroom at that time according to her phone activity log. The second figure's movement was stiff. Its head turned slowly toward the camera. The footage corrupted seconds later. Authorities found no evidence of tampering. The woman moved out within days. She refuses to review the video again. In part 5, we confront the oldest warning embedded within the legend, that the skinwalker's greatest weapon is not claws or teeth, but deception, and that survival may depend not on fighting, but on refusing to engage at all. Because if something is wearing a familiar face, and you answer when it calls, you may never know which version came back inside. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare. The desert at night is a different world. The sun bleeds out, and the silence that follows isn't peaceful. It's heavy, like it's holding its breath. My grandfather, a Navajo man who'd seen more winters than the oldest juniper tree on our land, always said the night air carries whispers. He told me stories, not to scare me, but to teach me, stories of the land, the spirits, and the things that walk in the shadows. Of all his tales, the one that always left a cold knot in my stomach was about the Skinwalker. He called them Yi Naldalushi, the ones who walk on all fours. They were once medicine men, he said, who chose a darker path, twisting their sacred knowledge for power, for malice. They can take the form of any animal, but their favorite is the coyote or the wolf. Sometimes even a deer or an owl, but no matter the shape, there's always something wrong. A gate that's just a little too human eyes, that burn with an intelligence that isn't animal. I grew up on the reservation, and you learn to respect these stories. You don't whistle after dark. You don't speak their name too loudly. You lock your doors, not just against men, but against things that mimic men. This happened last fall. My cousin, Leo, and I were driving back from Gallup. It was late, well past midnight. The road was a long dark ribbon stretched across the empty desert, the only light coming from our headlights cutting through the black. We were listening to music, talking about nothing important, when Leo suddenly killed the radio. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I hadn't. All I could hear was the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. "Hear what?" Sounded like tapping on the roof. We both fell silent, listening. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Then we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on the metal roof of the old pickup. My heart started hammering against my ribs. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were no trees overhead, no overpasses, nothing. "It's probably just a loose part," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. But we both knew that wasn't it. The sound was deliberate. Leo sped up, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The tapping stopped. For a moment, we both breathed a sigh of relief, and that's when we saw it. Standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of our headlight beam, was a large coyote. It wasn't right. It was too big, its legs too long, its fur mangy and matted in a way that seemed diseased. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. They weren't the yellow-green glint of a normal animal. They were dark, and they glowed with a faint, reddish light. They were watching us, not just seeing us, but watching us, with a cold, calculating intelligence. "Don't look at it," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "Just keep driving. Don't look at it in the eyes." My grandfather's warnings echoed in my head. They can paralyze you with their gaze. They can steal your face, your voice. I tore my eyes away, focusing on the dashboard, on my own shaking hands. But I could feel its gaze on the side of my face, like a physical weight. Leo floored it, the old truck groaning in protest. We shot past the creature. I risked a glance in the side mirror. It was gone. The spot where it had stood was empty. "It's gone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Leo didn't answer. He just kept driving, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The silence in the truck was thick with fear. The tapping started again. This time, it wasn't on the roof. It was on the passenger side window, right next to my head. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself against the opposite door. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. I could hear it though. A low, guttural breathing, just on the other side of the glass. And something else. A faint, scratching sound. "Faster, Leo. Go faster," I yelled. The truck was already rattling, pushed to its limit. The tapping became more frantic, harder. It sounded like someone was trying to break the glass with their knuckles. Then, a new sound joined the cacophony. A voice. It was a perfect imitation of my mother's. "Let me in, son," it crooned, the sound distorted by the wind and the engine's roar. "It's cold out here. Why won't you let me in?" My blood ran cold. My mother was 300 miles away, safe in her home. This thing, this monster, was using her voice. It was twisting something I loved into a weapon against me. "Don't listen to it," Leo shouted over the noise. "It's a trick. It's trying to get inside your head." The voice changed. Now it was my grandfather's, low and raspy. "You didn't listen to my stories, boy. Now it has your scent. It will follow you." I clamped my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block out the sound. It was inside my head now. It laughed, a dry, rattling sound like stones clattering down a canyon wall. The scratching on the window grew more intense, and I heard a sharp crack. The glass was starting to give way. Suddenly, a bright light flooded the cab. A car was coming from the opposite direction. As its headlights washed over us, the scratching, the tapping, the voice had all stopped. In the fleeting light, I saw it. For just a second, it wasn't a coyote anymore. It was a tall, unnaturally thin figure, covered in matted fur, its limbs long and twisted at impossible angles. It had no face, just a dark, hollow space where features should have been. And in that hollow, 2 red embers burned with pure hatred. The other car sped past, honking its horn, and the creature was gone, vanished back into the darkness from which it came. We didn't stop driving until we saw the first streetlights of our town. We pulled into my driveway and just sat there in the truck, shaking, as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with shades of gray and pink. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't have to. I still have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up to a tapping sound on my window, but it's just a branch in the wind. I hope it's just a branch. My grandfather was right. The night air carries whispers, and some things that walk in the shadows are better left undisturbed. If you're ever out in the desert, late at night, and you hear a strange sound or see an animal that just doesn't look right, lock your doors, don't look it in the eyes, and drive. Drive and don't look back. Some stories aren't just stories. Thanks for listening, and please, be safe out there.